You know, we talk a lot about lore these days. While the concept is not new by any stretch of the imagination, centering the entire narrative on the lore of a game's universe instead of its plot is still a relatively new design approach. Of course, when you think of lore, you probably associate it most with the Dark Souls series and Bloodborne, just due to their cryptic nature and their lack of direct storytelling. But what exactly is lore, and why is it thought of as something different from the basic story? Well, I think it goes something like this. In the context of gaming, lore is the collection of a world's history and its embedded mechanics. Now, when I say mechanics, I'm not referring to game mechanics in the traditional sense. It's more so the rules of that universe. If a fantasy world has magic, and its denizens can harness that magic to perform unique abilities, then that would be a component of that world's mechanics, which will naturally influence how its society is structured. It manifests itself as an extension of the setting, providing a foundation for the story. Taking all of this into consideration, the story is its own entity, even though it may draw heavily from the lore. While the lore provides the player with additional information about the world they're in, the story is the selected sequence of events that is depicted throughout the game. It's about embarking on a journey, meeting some new people along the way, and arriving at a destination, culminating in some long-awaited payoff. A well-written narrative should take both story and lore into account in its production. Here's an example of how they can complement one another when they're combined properly. The history of Spira, Final Fantasy X's universe, is structured around a false deity whose authoritarian regime forbids the inhabitants from using technology, or Machina as they call it. They're punished for this by suffering the wrath of a giant monster named Sin, who travels across the ocean and wipes out entire cities and villages in its wake. They're told that the original use of Machina is to blame for Sin's existence and its continued resurrection, and that the only way to put an end to it for good is to atone for their own sins and eradicate all uses of Machina. It utilizes a clever writing tactic by having the main character act as an avatar for the player in multiple ways. Tedious is thrown into the world with no understanding of its customs and practices or its troubled history. He serves the role of connecting the player to the world, because he learns about these things in the same way that you do as you're playing through the game. His confusion is your confusion, and his realizations are your realizations. The idea of making your way through a strange new world while trying to keep a level head is relatable to us because we all go through that at some point. It's one thing to learn about the war between Bevelle and Zanarkand, or about the corruption of the Yevon theocracy, but it's another thing to see the people of Spira suffer the consequences of those entanglements. In this way, the lore is used to strengthen the story, and the story reciprocates this by giving the lore meaning. Another game that demonstrates this concept is Ocarina of Time. The story is a classic portrayal of the hero's journey. You grow up in a peaceful village, but you're left feeling out of place because you don't have a fairy, and so you long for a sense of belonging. At the end of your journey, you conquer the great evil that plagues the land, which gives you the fulfillment you've been looking for, the ultimate treasure. It's a path of self-actualization, and is provided by the set of circumstances described to the player as they go about their journey. But there's also a deep lore embedded into the game that you don't think about too much because it's left to the background. The world of Hyrule was built by 3 goddesses, who each developed a certain aspect of the world, and stored their essence into an ancient artifact that's capable of granting great power to the one who claims it for himself. Technically, this does drive the story forward because Ganondorf obtains the Triforce of Power, which establishes the course of history for the next 7 years. But that part is literally skipped over from the player's perspective. The focus is instead placed on your response to the fall of the kingdom. This type of storytelling is commonly associated with Japanese RPGs and classic adventure games, and while they've been celebrated for decades, they've also had their fair share of criticism. This style is solid from a narrative standpoint, but implementing it into the interactive medium of video games comes with its own set of complications. For example, they tend to be set in stone. There usually aren't any alternate endings, nor are there any branching pathways you can take. But by telling a story in this way, you enable the player to live out the fantasy of being a chosen hero. A professional team of writers would come together to craft a very delicately structured story, meant to convey a certain feeling after the player experiences it. This kind of writing is much harder to pull off if you're able to alter the course of events, which makes it quite challenging for the writers of open-ended games with multiple scenarios and outcomes. Unless we're talking about Chrono Trigger, but most games don't come conveniently packaged with a time-traveling mechanic that happens to cater to the specific design problem. Without such an advantage, these games are forced to take a very different approach to writing altogether. Usually they have a bit of a lackluster story, but when you think about it, it has to be that way. The spirit of Western RPGs consists of freedom and customizable experiences. Not only does this pertain to exploration of the world, but also to ways in which the player can interact with it directly. The player makes a series of choices that greatly influences their journey throughout the game. In order for those choices to be meaningful, they have to have consequences, and the best way to convey that idea is to have those choices drive the story forward. It's self-evident as to why this complicates things when developing a story. As a developer, you have to ask multiple questions. For example, how many branching pathways will there be? How many additional cutscenes will need to be rendered into the game? How much will all of this add to development costs? And how much time will it take? The simplest solution to this problem is to purposely leave the story vague and straightforward. That way, the choices you make as a player can flow seamlessly from some common narrative origin. But there's a glaring problem with this approach. A minimalistic story may provide the writers with the flexibility they need to account for player choice, but it also makes it harder for players to immerse themselves into the fantasy. Even if you can mess around with the story and change its sequence of events, it's not particularly interesting if the story has little substance to it to begin with. In its absence, something else needs to be there to engage the player. It has to be meaningful, but it also has to be something that can withstand player meddling and still remain intact. And that's why lore has become the central focus of narrative development in modern games. Players are demanding more freedom from their games now than ever before. They don't really want to be told a story, they'd rather make their own. Or at the very least, they want to have the final say in how the story progresses. If Ocarina had come out today, and it had been developed with the lore at its center instead of the story, the writers would have focused on the history of the goddesses and the ways in which the various races of Hyrule interact with one another. More importantly, rather than being some prophetic hero, you would just be some Hylian wanderer, who may save the world, if you feel like it. Or you might otherwise seek to dethrone Ganondorf and become the king of evil yourself, you sick bastard. Or you might ignore the battle altogether and focus on using your high charisma to manipulate the Gorons and Zoras and trigger a war between them. Some of you are probably thinking that this would be a great idea for a mod or something of the sort, but the point is that in exchange for freedom, you're losing your sense of purpose as a preordained hero. There's a trade-off either way. But given this dichotomy, there's at least one game out there that's found a way to balance story and lore in a fresh new way. Dark Souls has its own unique approach to handling lore, and since it's been so successful at it, more games will be, and already have been, following in its example. It does have a very structured and orderly plot, but you're never told it directly, so it doesn't get in the way. You're never made to believe that you're some chosen hero. Hell, you're not really told anything. You just go and act out your most basic instincts to hunt after monsters, pick up loot, and die a lot. The most brilliant aspect of the Soulsborne games is in how they convey their stories. They leave you with just enough of the surface level to wonder what's going on, but they invite you to dig deeper on your own by reading item descriptions or by solving the riddles given to you by the NPCs. On one hand, you lose the ability to influence the story in multiple dimensions, aside from making an ultimately pointless choice in the end, but on the other hand, it feeds upon your own curiosity and imagination. Think of how easy it is to interpret the story in multiple ways. Yeah, there is technically one right answer, sort of, but its ambiguity in presentation leaves a lot of room for creativity. In doing so, it's developed its own method for solving the problem that I put forward earlier. For those who want to uncover the story, you can do it, and it's that much more engaging because you have to put in more effort to figure it all out. And for those who prefer a less committed narrative, it does very little to try and stop you. Earlier, I mentioned that Final Fantasy X uses its lore to strengthen the story, and that the story gives its lore meaning in return. Dark Souls works as well as it does because it embodies the same type of relationship, but it's unique in that it does so inversely. The story is mostly obscured, but it's used to strengthen the lore. The lore is what then gives the story itself meaning because it retroactively provides you with context. This is another way of reaching that equilibrium point between story and lore. But unfortunately, not all games are as well structured. Some of them are heavily slanted in one direction and remarkably lacking in the other. Kingdom Hearts puts so much of an emphasis into the story that even the gameplay suffers at times, let alone the basic coherency of its lore. It's so difficult to make sense of its universal mechanics because the story keeps throwing so many curveballs at you. Since the lore forms the foundational fabric of the world, it needs to be self-consistent, but the game sacrifices that for additional layers of complexity. And it only seems to get worse with every new installment. The writing comes off as impulsive and indecisive, with many lore-related aspects losing all meaning once some new twist is revealed that dismantles them. Even the concept of Kingdom Hearts itself changes its meaning from one game to the next. I'll still keep playing these games because I have to see how the saga wraps up when all is said and done, but the expanded story is far too ridiculous to give it a pass without its due criticism. While Kingdom Hearts prioritizes its story too heavily, there are other games out there that dump too much arbitrary information into the lore and treat the story as an afterthought. Skyrim is an example of one of these games in action. You play as a blank slate character whose identity and place in the world is completely up to you to choose. The downside to this, however, is that the whole progression of the plot boils down to dialogue trees. The execution scene with the dragon is probably as close as it gets to a truly cinematic event, and that's only because the game hasn't let you go off on your own yet. But if there's one thing Skyrim is full of, it's regional lore, a lot of it. There's so much exposition in this game about the political conflicts of the land that you end up feeling like you're in a history lecture. It's usually irrelevant to what you're doing in the game, as there are so many different things you can do at any given time. But since there are so many ways to interact with any given NPC, they can't be that well developed because of what we've already talked about earlier. This also makes it hard to become emotionally invested into the plot, because you don't feel like anything you do really matters, aside from what you can derive from it on your own. I realize that alone is probably good enough for many players, and more power to them if that's the case, because Skyrim has plenty to offer in place of a more engaging plot. To be fair, a game doesn't need a story to be interesting, but other genres engage the player in completely different ways, so they can forgo the story altogether. If there is an elaborate story, however, but it's held back, then it becomes a weakness. On the other hand, if the lore of a game is incomprehensible, then that's also a weakness. It's about finding that balance that we talked about earlier. In between these two extreme examples, you have plenty of great games that dare to explore uncharted territory by towing the line between a well-developed story and an imaginative fantasy upon which that story is built. Hyper Light Drifter centers itself on a story that's already happened. You run around in the aftermath of it and try to make sense of it, but that's what gives it its unique edge. Because it doesn't throw its lore at your face the entire time, it creates a more inviting atmosphere. The imagery and environmental storytelling fill in pretty nicely for an otherwise absent narrative. And that's just one example of how a game can do this balance right. Undertale is another example that demonstrates how to implement a meaningful story while preserving the player's freedom of choice. Not only do your decisions have serious weight to them, but the game's short length helps to facilitate additional playthroughs with ease. Whether you're all about an open world where you call the shots, or you'd rather play through a gripping tale that tugs at the heartstrings, the one thing that ties these games together is the passion that goes into their creation, and our desire to look at these games from different angles. Nothing is perfect, and that applies just as well to these two philosophies of game design. But when all is said and done, that's what makes these topics so much fun to talk about. Thank you for listening to me ramble on about games incoherently for all this time. If you like these types of videos, hit that subscribe button, and since you're in the area, check out these two videos as well. In any event, thanks again for watching. See you next time!
I don't care about your stories!